Why don't you have a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Let's have a chat about some more questions that I received. And I think I have some shorter ones today and one that will take us a bit more time. So I'll start with what was in my mind the simplest question. I'm just writing down a timestamp, sorry. Do you have any recommendations for in both pens and ink for left-handed people? This is a question that I receive a lot, and it's hard for me to answer because I'm not a left-handed person. I'm not a left-handed writer. Okay? Now, in this case, what I would like to do is defer you to a video that I did with my friend Sinister Peter a while ago. Sinister Peter, as his name suggests, is in fact left-handed, and we have a discussion and we do some writing, at least he does some writing, about these kinds of things. What he looks for in a nib, what he looks for in a pen. Now, to say something here and not just sort of make a commercial for another video I have, because I don't think that's very helpful to anyone, I would say often a somewhat drier nib can help because you smear less if you write from left to right, or a drier ink so that you don't smear it so much if you write from left to right. The best way to do it is to do what Leonardo da Vinci did. Write from right to left and mirror each letter and you'll have no problems. But of course, nobody will be able to read your handwriting. I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm just saying that this is a very valid concern, but I have a video dedicated to it. I don't want to repeat everything we said there because I think that may be boring to people, but I'll make sure I link to that video. Okay, that was one. Then I have the next one. I'm just writing down the stamp again. Are there any differences regarding the viability of an ink in cartridges versus converters? That's a really interesting question. And for me, the shortest answer is no, because you shouldn't leave an ink indefinitely in a cartridge or a converter. Why not? Because fairly simply, both cartridges and converters are made of plastic. Plastic is a little bit porous. An ink is a dye and water with some other constituents in it. And give it enough time and the water will evaporate. And when that happens, then you're left with the dye, so the ink will become darker because there is a higher ratio of dye to water than there was before. And as a result, in the worst case, your feed may clog up a little bit because of the dye particles. Now, this is not a huge deal because you can clean that out. Pigment particles can be a different story, but this is dye. So I don't think it matters really, cartridge or converter, because you don't leave an ink in there indefinitely anyway. Now, what's indefinitely? I don't know. For me, if I know that I'm not going to be using a specific pen for more than 2 weeks, I empty it and I clean it. And I store it empty. Which is also a reason I only have four pens inked up at any time. Why I don't need more. Other people may, but I don't. But that was not your question. Now, what I have seen in old boxes of cartridges is that the ink evaporates a bit. So the water evaporates a bit. But then you're talking about boxes of cartridges that are years old. I mean multiple years, 5 to 10 years old. Okay? So I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't worry that you're going to have issues with cartridges or converters in that regard, as long as you use them appropriately and you don't leave those ink reservoirs filled up for infinite periods of time. But it's a very interesting question to think about. Okay, this was an interesting question too, which I really had to think about for a bit. What are some odd pen styles or nib styles that have surprised you in a good way or a bad way? Think, for example, of the Sailor Cross Point that I have. And I did a series of videos, all the Sailor nibs. My friend Marco lent me the full set of Sailor nibs, which has everything in a King Eagle and a King Cobra and the cross points and the Concords and like all the fancy nibs. and I gave most of those back to him. Anyway, I'm just kidding. This is a very complicated question to answer because there are so many ins and outs to this. Here is something that I will say. I started off back in the day with medium nibs because I didn't know anything else. I didn't know what to purchase. Then my friend Sven convinced me to try broad nibs, and I got into this phase of broad nibs, and the broader the better. Broads, double broads, triple broads. If you've watched my videos for a while, you have seen me go through all these phases. The broad nibs are a lot of fun. I still really enjoy a good broad nib. There's more tipping material to polish, therefore they are smoother, they add a lot of character to your handwriting, but you do have to have large handwriting. The Sailor Cross point is really the limit of what my handwriting can handle because you have to write really quite largely with that nib. Was that a pleasant surprise? Absolutely. Do I love the cross point? Absolutely. It's a fantastic nib. And for the same reason, I like nice broad nibs and I like good italic nibs. I like all that. But I will say this. In all honesty, recently is a relative term, but in maybe the past year and a half, 2 years or so, I have actually found myself reaching for finer nibs more often. Not extra fine, but I found that a good fine nib that is not too skinny for my likes, so something in the fine to medium range, I've actually found really nice. Why? For everyday writing. A triple broad nib is fun until you find out that you can write 5 words on a line on a page, and so from an economical viewpoint, as you're just writing in a notebook and you have to write down a lot, as I sometimes do. Here are all my notes for these videos, for example. Finer nibs are great, and a properly tuned fine nib can be nice and smooth. You can't have any issues, or you don't have to have any issues with it. So I think for me personally, what has stood out to me most, what has surprised me most, is that I have found myself gravitating a bit towards finer nibs. Not extra fine. You're probably never going to see me with an extra fine nib because that's just not my jazz, so to speak. But I do like the finer nibs, and that's been an interesting development for me. Other things that have stood out, yeah, that depends also on how you define standout, right? Like some things, some cheaper pens have really surprised me in a positive way. Some expensive pens have really surprised me in a negative way. And many pens are somewhere in between, right? But that to me has been one of the more quote-unquote shocking revelations as far as I'm concerned. Okay, the final question that I wanted to answer today, and again I saved the somewhat more philosophical one for last, is this. I'm paraphrasing, but is it better to have one nib type, or is it better to have a range of nib types? And the person who asked this question went on to explain that in his case, he likes to have nibs of a certain kind. Say, these are not his words. I'm trying to explain this as concisely as I can, and I'm already failing based on the last sentence, but I'll just continue and pretend like nothing happened. It's not like I teach for a living. So he basically has nibs that he can interchange between pens. So that you buy one pen and then you have a whole range of nibs because they all fit in the same pen. That was pretty concise. Well done, Brown. Okay, so here's what I would say about that. In my mind, that's a fantastic question, and I can see where people come from, especially if you're building up a collection of fountain pens. I think it absolutely pays off to have different kinds of nibs because different kinds of nibs are fun. An italic nib is completely different from an extra fine nib, and it can give you a certain je ne sais quoi, a certain thing. It can lend a specific quality to your handwriting, which I think is a lot of fun. But I can fully see the point where people would say, extra fine. My handwriting is small, for example. Extra fine is all I need. I don't want anything else. Well, it's perfectly defendable. I've said this a couple of times in these videos. There's not necessarily here a right or wrong way to do it. With fountain pens, sometimes there is. If you put India ink or whiteout in your fountain pen, that is the wrong way to do it. When it comes to selecting nibs, you have to do what your heart tells you, boy. Do whatever you like. And I think that is important. But for me, the guiding principle has always been a fountain pen is a tool. and you use different tools for different purposes. If I have to sign a birthday card or fill out a form, then I can do it with a fountain pen, I will use a finer nib. If I want to write a message to someone that I want to have a bit more expressiveness, have a bit more character to it, I will use a broad nib, or I may use an italic nib, or I may even use a springy nib to have a bit of flexiness to the writing. And that's kind of part of the fun. So I think having a bit of a range of nibs, and that doesn't have to mean 4,000 nibs, right? But having a couple of nibs is fine. If I just think from the top of my head, I don't have that many pens, but I know that I have some fine nibs, I have at least one medium nib, I have some broad nibs, I have the very broad cross point. Do I even have an italic? Yeah, I have an italic. But that's it. And this is 20 pens? I don't even know. But it's not that many pens. But you adjust it to what you use it for. One character, italic nib, a broad nib, want something very clear, legible, simple, not too big, finer nib, etc. So I don't think it necessarily is a matter of, is one better than the other? It's what you want. And if it turns out that for you, a medium nib is what works best, well, then you're just a mediocre person. No, I'm just kidding. If a medium, I'm obviously kidding. If a medium nib works best, then why not purchase all your pens in a medium nib, right? Because that works for your handwriting, it's comfortable to you, then do that. You don't have to have a massive range. And I think people, again, often get carried away and, I should probably also have a 1.1 millimeters, and I should probably also have a 1.5, and I should probably also need a broad, otherwise I'm not part of the cool kids. Yes, you are. We're all cool kids. Look at this. You're watching a video on fountain pens. How cool is that, right? So, I am a nerd, so it's just the way it is. But that matters. Do what makes you happy. Pick what works for you. If you feel that you should have every nib, but it turns out you can't write with a broad nib because your handwriting is microscopic, then don't use a broad nib, right? Have fun with what you're doing. It's supposed to be a fun hobby. It's something that's supposed to be fun for everyone. And I think that's the most important thing. Do what works for you. Now, because the question I think was, are there any specific benefits? Yeah, but there are pros and cons to both. Having a nice broad lineup of nibs means that you have more writing modes, not really, but I think you understand what I mean, more options to choose from. And then, yeah, it may be a matter of I like a fine for this and a broad for that, etc. But again, if it turns out that medium or fine or broad, whatever, it always works for you, well, then doesn't it make a lot of sense to just purchase every pen that you have in that specific nib grade? Because then you know that you really love that. And this again comes down to exploring versus exploiting. There's nothing wrong with exploiting if you know that you like that thing. Then always buy the broad nib and you'll be fine. Right? So I think that's another advantage of that. I hope that was a bit of an answer to that question. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Let me know what you think about, or let me know what your preference is. Do you prefer having a nice wide lineup of nibs, or do you prefer to have one kind of nib, or do you like to have different, like the same pen with all kinds of different nib options, for example? Just let me know. I find it interesting. Any other questions you have, please leave them below. I hope I haven't bored you to death, and I will gladly see you again next time. Bye.